Ishar acknowledges the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land on which we provide our services. We continue to recognize and celebrate the spiritual connection that Noongar people have to country and pay tribute to Noongar elders past, present and emerging.
I am going to spend some time talking today about autism and specifically some of the barriers that people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities might face in terms of accessing autism diagnosis. But first I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people, traditional custodians of the land on which I stand today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'll also talk a little bit about the organisation. So I'm presenting from the Autism Association of Western Australia, and our mission here is to advance the personal development, equality of opportunity and community participation for people with autism. In today's presentation, I'm going to spend some time first talking about what autism is, and then do some myth busting around some of the common misconceptions about autism and its causes and potential cures. I'm going to talk a little bit about the representation of autism in the media, and then cover the experience of autism in CaLD communities, the process of autism diagnosis and some of the barriers that people from CaLD communities might face when accessing a diagnostic assessment for autism. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what is autism. So autism, as defined in our current diagnostic manuals, is by difficulties and differences in social communication and social interaction, and a pattern of restricted interests, repetitive behaviours and sensory preferences. In order for a person to be diagnosed with autism, we have to see both these difficulties with social communication and social interaction, as well as the rigid and repetitive behaviours. We can't see either of these parts of autism on their own in order to make a formal diagnosis. I also have a little video that does a better job than me of explaining what autism is from the perspective of an autistic person. So I'm going to play that video now.
Autism is a lifelong disability which affects how people, like me, communicate and interact with the world. There are about 700,000 adults and children on the autism spectrum in the UK. And like everyone, each autistic person has their own strengths and challenges. But all of us have difficulties with communicating and interacting with other people. This could mean not speaking at all, needing longer to process information, or not understanding facial expressions. We also engage in repetitive behaviour, doing or thinking the same thing over and over. This is sometimes for fun, and sometimes to help deal with our anxiety. People on the autism spectrum can also find unexpected changes, however small, very distressing. And then there is sensory overload, where noise, smells, touch, and bright lights become very painful and overwhelming. All these challenges can make the world feel very scary and hard to understand, and sometimes send us into physical and emotional meltdowns or shutdowns. It is very important that autistic people get help from an early age. But life can become very difficult if children or adults don't get the right support or understanding. Autistic children are 3 times more likely to be excluded from school. Only 1 in 6 autistic people in the UK have a full-time job. and over a third of autistic adults have reported serious mental health problems. The National Autistic Society is the UK's leading charity for autistic people. Since 1962, we have been changing society's attitudes and transforming individuals' lives. We want to create a society that works for autistic adults and children, and with your help, we can.
I think that what this video really captured is the varying experiences of people on the autism spectrum, the range of challenges that they might face that are not only because of their inherent differences, but also some challenges navigating an environment that's not set up to be accepting and tolerant of the different ways in which people communicate and interact with the world around them. In addition to those core differences in social communication and social interaction and some rigid and repetitive behaviours, many people on the autism spectrum also have difficulties in areas of thinking and behaviour. So, for example, there are lots of autistic people who have challenges with theory of mind, or being able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes or take somebody else's perspective, which impacts the way they might understand and perceive other people's feelings and respond to those feelings. Many of the challenges that autistic people experience are related to executive function difficulties as well. Executive function is almost like the conductor of your brain system, and it pulls together different areas of thinking like planning, organisation, scheduling, and time management. And so challenges in areas of executive function make things like organisation and navigating environments like school and employment settings really challenging for people on the spectrum. And then people on the spectrum often have great strengths in areas like detail-focused processing, where a person on the spectrum might pay attention to small details, sometimes at the expense of the global whole, but that detail-focused processing can be a great strength in different areas of jobs like coding or auditing or accounting. And another great area of strength is what we call monotropism, which can be a bit like an attention tunnel, where people on the autism spectrum can become so focused on a task or activity that anything going on around them isn't part of that attention tunnel. And that monotropic interest can be a great strength in terms of finding employment that relates to interest or passions. It helps people gain an enormous amount of knowledge about very specific topics or interests that can be of great benefit to them across different settings and contexts. In addition to some of those core differences and differences in thinking and behavioural style for people on the spectrum, often they have additional medical or mental health conditions or other neurodevelopmental conditions that sometimes can be just as upsetting or have just as big an impact on a person's everyday function as those core features of autism. So it's very rare that we actually see an autistic person who just has autism. Often it's associated with additional challenges that create extra barriers for the person as they're navigating their world and different environments. But in saying all of that, autism is considered a spectrum because it represents a diverse range of experiences. No person on the autism spectrum has the same profile of strengths or support needs or challenges. That whole spectrum represents a huge variety in experiences of autism and experiences of the world. Now that we've had a brief introduction into understanding what autism is, I'm going to cover some of the myths about autism and some of the misconceptions that we might hold about autism and the reasons for which people might have autism. So one of the first myths is that there is an autism epidemic, because we're increasingly seeing pictures of autism in the media, we're increasingly hearing about more and more people being diagnosed with autism, and it is true that the frequency that autism is diagnosed has been increasing over time. From the 1960s, when our diagnostic rates were about 1 in 2,500, to now where estimates are that between 1 in 70 and 1 in 100 Australians have an autism spectrum condition. And this represents the largest primary disability category in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. This doesn't necessarily represent an epidemic, but instead represents changes in the way that we've understood autism over time, from what was originally conceptualised as a very narrow condition, often only seen in people who also had an intellectual disability, to one that's now a much broader spectrum and probably represents a whole range of different autisms rather than just one diagnostic category or diagnostic group. We've also gained much more information about the subtle ways in which autism might present in people who don't have a co-occurring intellectual disability. There's much better awareness of what autism is amongst the community and amongst health professionals, and much better identification of autism in the very early years, but also better understanding of the way that autism might present in adolescents and adults as well. So while our figures and the frequency of autism has increased over time, it likely reflects those broader changes in understanding and identification rather than a true increase in the number of people with autism now compared to historically. But in saying that, there are vast numbers of people who probably aren't captured in our figures about the frequency of autism. So we don't know very much about how often autism is occurring in culturally and linguistically diverse communities, because they tend not to be included in prevalence studies. Most of our understanding of autism to date has been from the US or Europe, so we have a very narrow understanding of how autism presents only in people with European heritage. In some countries, we know that some racial and ethnic groups have lower diagnostic rates, which probably represents disparities in access to diagnosis and diagnostic services, rather than there being a true difference in the number of people that are diagnosed with autism in those different groups. And globally, the few studies that have explored diagnostic rates in Indigenous populations have shown that there are lower diagnostic rates, for example, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That represents a whole range of different reasons. Some of that diagnostic disparity is because of cultural differences in understanding what autism is, geographic factors in terms of having to travel long distances in order to access either diagnostic or support services, but also the influence of historic oppression and discrimination, which has created health inequality generally in Indigenous groups. And that means that although we've seen increasing prevalence of autism over time, in people of low and middle income countries, there are likely to be many autistic people who are not yet identified and not yet diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, which means that they may not have access to evidence-based supports and skill development opportunities that might be able to help particularly children navigate their social environment as they grow older. There's also been a long-standing myth that autism can only be diagnosed in children. And we've certainly found that that's not the case. Firstly, we know that autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. So children who are diagnosed with autism grow up to be autistic adults. We also have much better understanding now of the subtle ways that autism presents in women and adults. And there are a large number of autistic adults who weren't identified as being autistic when they were children because they didn't necessarily have a classic presentation, or they didn't necessarily fit our historical diagnostic classification systems. And that has resulted in very high rates of autistic adults who are either undiagnosed or unrecognised as being on the autism spectrum, and often present to services with co-occurring mental health difficulties or challenges, or after having being unable to maintain employment, rather than presenting because they're acknowledging and recognising features of autism. The identification of autism in adulthood has often meant that autistic adults have missed opportunities for supports or services, and also missed out on the opportunity to understand themselves and establish an autistic identity and connect with an autistic community from when they're younger in age, which also likely contributes to some of the ongoing mental health difficulties. And so because there is a high likelihood of an autistic adult being misdiagnosed and misunderstood, often they experience significant distress and also don't have opportunities to access tailored supports and scaffolds. And so there's a very large body of research now showing that there is a generation of people who missed out on being diagnosed with autism in childhood. Another common misconception is that only boys are autistic, and historically that was the case. In the very early years when autism was first identified, more boys than girls did have autism diagnoses, and girls who were diagnosed with autism often had more significant challenges than similarly aged boys. But over time, it's being increasingly acknowledged and recognised that autism is not identified as frequently in girls as women as perhaps it should be. And for example, the figures up on the slide there have come from a very large study conducted in the United Kingdom, showing the differences in diagnostic rates between boys and girls at different ages. So by age 6, around a quarter of autistic boys have been diagnosed, compared to only 8% of autistic girls. And by 11, only 20% of autistic girls have been diagnosed, compared to 50% of autistic boys. So that's really representing discrepancies in diagnostic rates between boys and girls, with many autistic girls and women likely missing out on diagnosis when they're very young. There's a whole range of reasons for that. Some of it reflects gender stereotypes about expectations of social behaviour. Some of it represents recognition biases in that, boys who tend to be a bit more boisterous, a bit more disruptive, might be recognised as having neurodevelopmental differences, but girls who perhaps are a bit more passive and shy might not be identified as having neurodevelopmental differences early on. Lots of girls and women on the spectrum have experienced misdiagnosis before they're coming to receive an autism diagnosis, typically around conditions like anxiety, and it's only later on, as they tend to get a little bit older, that it's recognised that the anxiety is probably driven by underlying features of autism, and that relates in late diagnosis for many girls and women. So although historically there were differences in diagnostic rates between girls and boys, we're increasingly understanding and recognising that there may actually be more parity in diagnostic rates than we had originally thought. So one of the very harmful myths that was first propagated in the late 1990s was that autism is caused by vaccines. Unfortunately, this myth caught on, despite the fact that there have been very large, very systematic, very well replicated research studies that has consistently demonstrated that autism is not at all related to exposure to vaccines. In fact, the causes of autism are likely to be multifaceted, and lots of different factors interact in order to lead to the development of autism in a particular person. Some of those underlying causes are inherent to the person, like underlying genetic factors. We know that there are some specific genes that are associated with autism, but lots of, different or unexpected genetic factors influence the development of autism. There's underlying biological elements to autism, as well as different ways in which the brain processes information. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, so we know that there are differences in the brains of people with autism compared to those who are not autistic. We just don't fully understand what those brain differences are. But often when a person has autism, there are these underlying biological factors, but the disability is often exacerbated by the environment and social factors. So there are factors like physical barriers, attitudinal barriers, communication barriers, and social barriers that make disability associated with autism even more pronounced, because society hasn't yet set up a world that's accepting and accommodating of a vast range of different communication experiences and preferences. Another myth, there is a cure for autism, and there is no known cure for autism. And in fact, there are many ethical challenges around finding a possible cure for autism, because autism is increasingly being seen as part of the natural spectrum of human diversity and an inseparable aspect of a person's identity. And so aligning with the social model of disability, which is suggesting that it's environmental factors that create disability for a person, then we should be changing the environment and implementing environmental supports and scaffolds, rather than changing a person's inherent identity and who they are. So the idea of a cure is very heavily linked to the medical model that suggests that all features of autism are inherent for the person that need to be fixed and treated and cured, in contrast to our social model of disability, which suggests that we need to be changing attitudes and communication preferences and environments in order to support people and accommodate for differences in a way that helps people be successful and successfully navigate a world that sometimes doesn't make sense. So rather than cure, we take a twofold approach to support, one of which is building skills to help people who have differences in communication or social interaction to build the skills so they can navigate social environments, paired with creating supportive environments, so ones that build on a person's strengths and also help to accommodate areas of difference. It's also a myth that the autism spectrum is linear. So there have been long-standing ideas that autism falls on a line, and at one end of the line a person doesn't have autism, and the other end of the line a person does have autism and has very high support needs. But in fact, because of the variation in experiences of being on the autism spectrum, we know that rather than a linear construct, it's much more circular, where any person on the spectrum can have strengths and challenges in any of these different areas. So the profiles are more spiky. We don't necessarily see more or less autism, but we see the different and divergent patterns of strength and challenge amongst autistic people. So this is just a very quick touch on some of the representations of autism in the media. So if you were to do a very quick search of autistic characters, very quickly we see that we find characters who represent the stereotypic white male presentation of what autism is, which means that there's a whole range of autistic experiences that aren't being captured in some of the more recent or contemporary models of autism as presented in the media. And that has big implications for understanding what autism is in CaLD communities. Because our research has come from these Western and English-speaking and often high-income countries, experiences of autism by CaLD communities aren't being represented, for example, in the media. Our understanding of social communication and social interaction differences is driven often by Western ideas about how people communicate and interact with others. But we know that there are differences in childhood experiences and developmental expectations and parental and community perceptions of what perhaps a typical behaviour is and what is a atypical behaviour that needs monitoring and follow-up. And those cultural differences in understanding early childhood developmental trajectories in particular really impact recognition of autism in non-Western communities. We really don't know whether our Western perception of typical social communication holds across different cultures. We really have very little understanding of whether the developmental trajectory is the same across different cultures. And we certainly know that some of our screening and diagnostic tools that are being used in professional practice probably aren't culturally sensitive and probably aren't capturing some of those cultural differences in social communication and social interactions. And similarly, because our approaches to support and intervention have often been developed in Western countries as well, it means that our supports and interventions are likely to be culturally biased and may need to be adapted in order to be suitable for non-Western cultures and communities. And I guess to contextualise this a little bit in Australia, there has been very little research and understanding of experiences of autism in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders until just a few years ago when one of the first, if not the first, reports on the experience of autism in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders was released. And this report, it followed the experiences of 12 parents and caregivers of autistic children and really demonstrated that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are often missing out on diagnosis or are being misdiagnosed, and that experience of misdiagnosis is exacerbated by living often in remote communities where access to health services and diagnostic expertise are really limited. There were descriptions of diagnostic substitution in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, so children who were more likely to perhaps be diagnosed with an intellectual disability and adults more likely to be diagnosed with a significant mental health condition rather than being diagnosed accurately with autism. And also the report demonstrated how cultural norms impact the perception of autistic traits. So the people who were documented in the report were describing a reluctance to label their children and just a general mistrust of labels, which reflects historical experiences of discrimination and oppression. The families also highlighted gaps in understanding autism and being aware of what autism is and characteristics of autism in their local communities, but also just a general acceptance of people being who they are with their strengths and challenges, and cherishing people's unique identities without needing to label a person as being different or having a disability. It also means that Aboriginal children are underrepresented in terms of accessing particularly early intervention services. So when the rates of accessing schemes like the Helping Children with Autism package have been investigated, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tended to be less likely to access those types of services. And also they were less likely to see children with more subtle presentations of autism. So it was children who really had quite high support needs that were more likely to access services and supports. Families are also describing being confused by the advice and post-diagnostic supports that are being available. And I guess that is exacerbated as well by being in remote communities where you might not have a local health provider who can provide ongoing support and services. And also families were describing a lot of reliance on community-based supports, kinship structures and family, rather than reliance on health professionals as well. This is really just the first part of our understanding of the experiences of autism in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. The report was only released in 2019, and it's our very first look at the representation of autism in these communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about autism diagnosis now and some of the barriers that CaLD communities might face when accessing autism diagnosis. So I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that autism is defined as having difficulties in social communication and social interaction, and also a pattern of restricted interests and repetitive behaviours. So when a person is diagnosed with autism, that diagnosis is based on observations of behaviour. We don't have any underlying biological markers that let us know that autism is a diagnosis that should be considered. So an autism diagnosis really does require a lot of clinical judgment and expertise. We have a range of diagnostic criteria, and a person seeking an autism diagnosis has to meet a number of those diagnostic criteria in order to be determined to have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. We also can specify as part of a diagnosis whether autism occurs with or without an intellectual disability, with or without another neurodevelopmental condition like ADHD, or with or without language impairment. We then assign an overall severity level, which is better described or better captures the level of support a person needs at this particular time in their life. That's divided into 3 different levels that vary based on the supports that a person needs, with recognition that those support needs might change over time and that the support is not fixed. So that level of support need is not fixed and is not determined for a person's lifetime. I guess over the top of this, we also need to consider conceptual frameworks for the way in which autism is recognised and diagnosed in culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So this is a nice conceptual framework that demonstrates some of the impacts of diverse cultural experiences on the different stages of autism recognition, identification, and diagnosis. So, for example, at the first level, we need to think about how the features of autism are being expressed and observed, so the person's presentation of autism. And although those two broad domains of social communication and then a pattern of rigid and repetitive behaviours are universal across different cultures, there are subtle differences in the way that the specific features of autism might present across cultures. So, for example, one of the behaviours that's observed as part of an autism diagnostic assessment is a person's use of eye contact. We know that there is huge cultural variation in the way in which eye contact is used. Aboriginal people often avoid making eye contact, and in other cultures, like in China, it's perceived impolite if a child makes direct eye contact with an adult. So we have to consider those cultural differences, or the subtle cultural differences in the expression of autism when determining whether a person meets the diagnostic criteria or not. There's also cultural differences in the frequency or impact of some of the features of autism, or parents' perception of the impact of autism on everyday activities and function. So in some cultures, behaviours that might be considered atypical for a child at their age and stage of development might be considered quite typical for a child in another culture. And so that parental perception of the child's difficulties impacts the recognition of features of autism, and then them bringing those features of autism to the attention of healthcare providers. And so the evidence that we have suggests that the age at which parents first become concerned about possible autism-related features is higher in people from non-Western backgrounds. This relates to a whole range of different factors, including, as I've mentioned, cultural differences in what's considered typical behaviour for the child's age, and also general parental understanding and literacy about health and developmental status. There are also differences in parenting roles across cultures, and also competing priorities. So for families who might be facing, for example, poverty or other socioeconomic challenges, the child's overall development might not be a priority or a key area of focus because there are other significant challenges for that family at that time. I've also mentioned that we have culture-bound explanations of what autism is in terms of biology, the medical model, and the social models of disability. Other cultures don't share those beliefs. So in some cultures, autism is seen as a Western neurodevelopmental condition. The cultural perception is bound in Western ideas about child development. And some cultures also have religious explanations about their child's differences and traditional explanations, rather than adhering to Western views about the impact of biology on child development. And all of those factors, so differences in the way in which autism might present, parental recognition of features that might be part of autism, the way that they conceptualise and understand the features of autism that they might be observing, all impact whether the family seeks help seeks help from a health professional versus somebody within the local community, and that then impacts the information they receive, their access to diagnostic services, and their access to ongoing support and intervention. So when we're thinking about autism diagnosis outside of a Western context, these are all the different layers that we have to understand, and this is the lens that we have to put on our assessments of families from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. In Australia, in 2018, the first National Guideline for the Assessment and Diagnosis of Autism was released. And this really provided a national standard for autism diagnosis that tried to align the diagnostic process across all Australian states, which have traditionally been very divergent in their approach to autism assessment and diagnosis. So this is the clinical pathway for autism diagnosis in Australia. It's recommended that a child presenting with autism concerns, or a parent concerned about their child's development, first receive an assessment of functioning paired with a medical examination. And if, as part of that initial assessment, it's suggested that autism might be a likely explanation for the child's challenges, a child will be referred for a further assessment from a single clinician, which can be a paediatrician or psychiatrist or psychologist with endorsement in clinical or educational psychology. At that stage of the assessment process, a diagnosis will either be confirmed or it will be not determined, in which case a family will pursue a consensus team diagnostic evaluation, which is an assessment that will involve a whole multidisciplinary team of health professionals with expertise in the assessment and diagnosis of autism. While this is the ideal and is designed to really, unite diagnostic processes across the nation, there are still barriers to accessing autism assessment and diagnosis for CaLD communities. Some of these I've touched on already, so I won't spend too much time going over them again. But I guess there's factors related to the child and the family, and then there are broader systemic factors that present barriers to accessing diagnostic services. So I've mentioned already that there might be differences in autistic features between groups, or different perceptions about what's typical versus not typical, or different expectations about how a child should behave across different settings. But there are a whole range of family and cultural factors that create barriers to autism diagnosis and assessment. Some of those are language barriers, information not being presented to people in their first language, cultural perceptions of differences in development and behaviour, which I've touched on already. But things that I haven't touched on are about stigma. So in non-Western cultures, there might be stigma attached to having a child with a disability that's either internalised stigma from the parents or stigma amongst their community and families feeling like other people are talking about them and their child when their child is diagnosed with a disability. Families might experience either explicit or implicit discrimination in health services, and also might have quite a limited understanding of health and of the healthcare system more generally, and even how to go about accessing support from a GP or a paediatrician. There's been evidence internationally showing that families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are less likely to follow through on referrals than families from English-speaking backgrounds. So even after concerns about a child's development have been identified and a referral for further assessment initiated, those families might not pursue the extra assessment that's needed. And lots of families have had prior negative experiences with health professionals and medical specialists that might make them more reluctant to pursue ongoing support or assessment. We've talked about how some families might not recognise developmental differences in their child, but sometimes professionals don't have knowledge about the different ways in which features of autism might differ between different cultures. So even if a family has pursued a diagnostic assessment and access to health professional, that health professional might not have knowledge and expertise about the different presentations of autism or non-typical presentations of autism. And there's also been some evidence of discrimination and bias in referral practices. So perhaps families not being referred for ongoing assessment because professionals perhaps don't recognise non-typical presentations of autism in CaLD communities. And I think really importantly, particularly in the Australian context, there are lots of systemic factors that present barriers to families accessing diagnostic services. Diagnosis is expensive, so many families can't afford the financial cost, particularly of an assessment in the private sector, but then face long wait times in the public system. The geographic accessibility of services and the long travel times for families to access the service and expertise that they need often presents a barrier, particularly for families who live in regional and remote areas who might have to travel to major cities or capital cities because there is no local expertise or no local developmental team. So that really impacts access and availability of services. Many remote communities might not have a paediatric specialist out there. But also there's factors around the acceptability of services, particularly when people are accessing perhaps Western services who might not have a shared understanding of factors like culture and religion that impact the family's perception of their child's development. I don't even think this captures the full extent of the barriers that families face when accessing diagnostic services. We know very little about the experiences of CaLD communities, and this is just a summary of some of the factors that contribute to diagnostic disparities. Even once families have access to diagnostic service, there are further barriers in the diagnostic process. One is that educational information might not be translated into the language that families need, so they might not have adequate information or knowledge about what the assessment process is, what is autism, and their awareness of autism and how that's explained to a family might not be translated into a language that they can understand. Families might be expected to fill in really long developmental questionnaires when they have low English levels or low literacy levels, which might be a barrier even before they can get into a diagnostic service. And our measures, so the assessments that we use as part of a diagnostic assessment, aren't culturally sensitive. So I've mentioned a couple of times about these differences in the presentation of autism, perhaps between cultures. The diagnostic assessments that we used, again, have been developed in Western contexts. The participants have been primarily of European heritage, so our screening and diagnostic tools might not be sensitive to those subtle differences in the presentation of autism. They also often involve materials that a range of families might never have seen before. So often our measures include toys. Families might not have had an experience playing with toys. Some of the questionnaires have to be handwritten by families. Again, if families aren't speaking English as a first language, then they might not be able to complete those questionnaires. There might be subtests within some of our diagnostic measures that don't adequately capture the social experiences of all communities. So, for example, one of the gold standard measures for autism diagnosis is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. That includes a birthday party scenario, and it's very possible that not every culture celebrates birthdays in the same way that we do. So then differences in the child's engagement in that play might not reflect differences related to autism, but actually cultural background. Families might need translation or interpreting as part of diagnostic assessments, but some of our tools also aren't set up to be delivered via an interpreter. So the ADOS is one example of that. So if we're assessing a young adult or an adolescent who doesn't speak English as a first language, the ADOS, our gold standard tool, can't be delivered via an interpreter. So we have to use alternative measures and methods in order to conduct a thorough and robust diagnostic assessment. Families might convey that the diagnostic outcome has not been effectively communicated to them, perhaps because an interpreter hasn't been available, or perhaps because the family didn't know what autism was, even at the time that the assessment was initiated. And then there's barriers post-diagnostically as well, where families might not have the local knowledge and expertise to provide post-diagnostic support and facilitate access to culturally sensitive supports and interventions following an autism diagnosis. So the National Guideline has some recommendations around autism diagnostic assessment. However, even in our Australian guideline, it's acknowledged that we know very little about the experiences of autism amongst a range of different cultures, including amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So the recommendations about the approach to autism assessment in CaLD communities are quite general, because we don't have specific evidence to guide our diagnostic approach. So I guess primarily the recommendations and important considerations when conducting autism assessments in CaLD communities are that the assessment team should be considering the racial and ethnic background of the person who's being assessed and their family, and how those cultural factors, many of which I've touched on today already, might influence the diagnostic process. For Aboriginal people in particular, it's recommended that the whole community is acknowledged. The role of the family, extended family and community is considered as part of the diagnostic process. It's also recommended that families receive cultural support, like from an Aboriginal health worker, if that's available. And that should be available to families from the point of referral through the whole diagnostic process. I know of circumstances when families, particularly Aboriginal families, have become very distressed because they haven't had the opportunity to have an Aboriginal health worker as part of their assessment, and that's caused a lot of anxiety. So that's an essential part of the process as well. And as I mentioned, families should always be offered interpreter services and information about autism and supports and the diagnostic process in their own language. And I think overarching all of this is communication that needs to be clear and nuanced. It's an integral part of any clinical interaction, and so it's really essential that families are given clear, nuanced information in a language and form that can be understood to them. So this has kind of been a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the myths around autism and barriers to accessing diagnostic services. But I guess the key messages are that there is lots of misinformation and myths about autism. And so anytime a person is trying to find information about autism, it's important to use evidence and reliable sources. We know very little about the experiences of autism in CaLD communities, although there has been a global call and increasing interest in understanding the vast experiences of autism across low and middle income countries, across cultures, and across languages as well. And there are barriers to autism diagnosis, and that really contributes to diagnostic disparities and delayed autism diagnosis in childhood, which has significant and important impacts for access to supports that have the potential, particularly in childhood, to give the children skills that they need to navigate the social world as they grow older. So I guess as a professional, as a health professional, and hopefully for other health professionals, we really need to make sure that we're trying to reduce those barriers as much as possible so that all families can have equal access to diagnostic services and can then access the supports that they need that are tailored to the needs of the child and the family.